Welcome to the U.S. latest news channel. Watch the video to the end to find out the current and breaking news about the Russian war in Ukraine. According to the statement made by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry recently, the Russian army has begun to form a defensive line in certain areas in the face of the advancing Ukrainian army. At the beginning of these regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions, where referendums were held recently on the instructions of Russian President Vladimir Putin, are located. Vadim Skibitsky, a representative of the Ukrainian intelligence agency, claimed that the Russian army blew up 2 bridges and dams located on the crossing route of the Ukrainian army with ballistic missiles in order to stop the advance of the advancing Ukrainian army. Vadim Skibitsky continued his statement, adding that the Russian army could not launch any counterattack against the Ukrainian army due to insufficient equipment and insufficient number of soldiers. According to information obtained by the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence, the Russian army is preparing to move from an offensive position to a defensive position in the occupied territories. The Russian army has previously made this defensive position in the Kherson region of Ukraine, but it has not been successful in stopping the advance of the Ukrainian army. Russian President Vladimir Putin, in a statement, the Russian army occupied by the Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia regions, a potential attack that would be seen as an attack on the territory of Russia, Ukraine, and Russia announced it will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. The Russian military has been losing strength since it began the invasion on the orders of President Vladimir Putin. The economic sanctions imposed on Russia since the invasion began are also seen as one of the main factors that have profoundly affected the Russian economy and caused Russia to lose power. At the same time, Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to have been left alone by his allies, especially Belarus, after opposing the referendums that will be held in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. As part of the partial mobilization announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin, it was announced by Russian officials that more than 400,000 volunteers attended mobilization camps in order to join the Russian army. Ukrainian intelligence agency officials claimed that the Russian army no longer has the power to invade Ukraine or even protect the occupied territories. Ukrainian intelligence agency officials continued their statements, saying that some of the Russian citizens who were recruited into the military with partial mobilization, which will be established by mid-October, have surrendered to the Ukrainian army, and added that Russian President Vladimir Putin no longer has enough soldiers in the Russian army. Expert in war analysis Mykola Bieliskov said that Russia has now completely failed in the invasion of Ukraine and that Russia should now protect its own territory. A small but militarily powerful country on its border should scare Vladimir Putin. According to a statement by officials of the intelligence service of Ukraine, the top commanders of the Russian army, especially in front line to the east of the River Oskol-Kharkov region, that have announced that the defense has ordered to be passed to the state, but the prolongation of the war in the Russian army as that induced by the reluctance of the soldiers to escape the war, and particularly the law enforcement officers of Ukraine in the past week, Russian President Vladimir Putin said. It looks harder for the surrender of 400 Russian soldiers. Speaking to Ukrainian state television, a U.S. war expert official said that Russia's biggest problem right now is the defense of the active 1,300 kilometers front by the Russian army, but it does not seem that this is possible due to the inexperience of Russian citizens recruited by Russian President Vladimir Putin as part of the mobilization. According to many war analysts of different nationalities, Russia now has to protect its own borders rather than the occupied territories in Ukraine, because Volodymyr Zelensky recently made a statement signaling that the occupied territories will be retaken and the territories that belonged to Ukraine in the past will be taken back. According to analyst Mykola Bieliskov, Ukrainian war, Russian President Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization to stop the progression of Ukraine, or Ukraine is not seen as a factor that will interfere with the progress of the Russian army and the Russian army occupation of the Ukraine since the beginning of heavy equipment that no longer exists and sufficient personnel losses, he said. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement, the territory of Ukraine available in a referendum as one of the lands now managed by Russian authorities after the results were announced in case of any attack on the territory of Russia, and this land will be deemed no qualms about resorting to nuclear weapons, he said. Some media outlets in the West have started reporting that Russian President Vladimir Putin's real plan since the invasion began is to start a possible nuclear war around the world. Russian President Vladimir Putin said decisively at a summit of world leaders, including Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, that Russia had not used any nuclear forces in the invasion of Ukraine, but that Russia would not refrain from using any technology available to the Russian military if its borders were threatened. With the instructions of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Russia continues to carry out activities other than the partial mobilization announced to compensate for its military personnel lost as a result of Ukraine's counterattacks and to maintain reserve soldiers in the war. With close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said that the Chinese will be made to Russia to help any soldier. Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, even though Russian President Vladimir Putin next week with a counselor that will be meeting on support for military personnel and private mercenary soldiers with close ties to Russian President Vladimir Putin, told Chinese media outlets have claimed. In its report, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that the Russian army no longer has enough strength, and the Russian army has groupings within itself, and many Russian soldiers have surrendered to Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. It was also announced by the Ukrainian intelligence agency that the Russian army launched a mobilization in Crimea, which is under the occupation of the Russian army, in order to forcibly recruit and send summons to Crimean men. According to another report published by the Ukrainian intelligence agency, 29 people were found in the Russian region of eastern Ukraine. The battalion army is stationed in Zabaykalsky Bay, and the 36th Battalion is stationed in the village of Borzia, another village in the region. It was announced that the Motorized Rifle Brigade is located and a total of 4 battalions have been deployed in the region for defensive purposes on the instructions of Russian President Vladimir Putin. It was also announced in October that the Russian soldiers recruited by Russian President Vladimir Putin as part of the mobilization made up the vast majority of these battalions. It was determined that the officers in the battalions were officers trained at the Far Eastern Higher Weapons Command School in Russia. 21, who graduated from the Black Sea Higher Naval School of Russian Army soldiers who were taken prisoner in the Sevastopol region, which was in the hands of the occupying Russian army on the territory of Ukraine, but was recently recaptured by the Ukrainian army. It was announced that it was a rifle regiment. In the continuation of the report published by the Ukrainian intelligence service, it was also claimed that Russian citizens recruited by Russian President Vladimir Putin as part of the mobilization were not senior soldiers, and many Russian citizens sent to the defense line surrendered to police stations and headquarters located in the region and under the administration of the Ukrainian army. In a video posted on its social media account, the Ukrainian intelligence service published a video about Russian citizens who were partially conscripted as part of the mobilization, but surrendered to Ukrainian law enforcement agencies. The General Staff of Ukraine announced in a recent statement that on the instructions of Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukrainian citizens on the territory of Ukraine occupied by the Russian army were forcibly taken to Russia and asked to be conscripted, and as a result of the escape of a Ukrainian citizen, they learned this information. While the rapid advance of the Ukrainian army has continued since September 14th, the discovery of civilians killed during the Russian occupation at the Yannakivsky metallurgical plant has caused great repercussions in the world press. In response to allegations with Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the Ukrainian army and the Russian army were slaughtered its own people, and Vladimir Putin also claimed that Russia and US in the continuation of the description and managed in accordance with the Russian army to the region, and the ideas brought peace to Ukraine and the territory of Ukraine occupied, and thanks to them they claimed citizens are happy. In Crimea, which is under the occupation of the Russian army, a ban has been imposed on the exit of any man from Crimea without obtaining the necessary permits by order of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russian state authorities have reported that they have returned 400 prisoners from a prison in the occupied city of Tambov to Ukraine. On the territory of Ukraine, which is under the occupation of Russia, the war strategy was changed to defense instead of offensive by the instruction of Russian President Vladimir Putin. On the night of September 27, 2022, the Russian army carried out intensive attacks on an area where nuclear power plants are concentrated in southern Ukraine. Energodom National Nuclear Power Generation Company, one of the leading nuclear energy companies in Ukraine, announced that an explosion occurred 300 meters from the main reactors as a result of Russia's attacks, but there were no casualties. Since the beginning of the occupation, which began by order of Russian President Vladimir Putin, the Russian army, including nuclear power plants, hospitals, schools, and the concentration of civilians, continues to organize attacks with heavy weapons. As a result of this attack that took place last night, it was announced by the Ukrainian authorities that 3 high-voltage power transmission lines exploded in the region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posted a video on his social media account showing and proving that the Russian military deliberately and willingly bombed the southern Ukrainian nuclear power plant. Volodymyr Zelensky, in a statement made after the video was published, said that the Russian military stopped intensive attacks after, but then the Ukrainian military intervened, and Russian President Vladimir Putin's attack on nuclear power plants is a threat to the whole world. The southern Ukrainian nuclear power plant, a nuclear power plant around the city of Yuzhno-Ukrainsk in the Mykolaiv region, has been subjected to intense attacks by the Russian military in recent weeks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the Russian military's attack on nuclear power plants is a threat to the whole world and that Russia and the Russian military must be stopped urgently. In a statement, Russian Defense Ministry officials claimed that the Russian military did not have any attacks on nuclear power plants and that the nuclear power plants that were damaged as a result of the wrong attack by the Ukrainian army were damaged. Who do you think will be the winner of the Russian-Ukrainian war?